I'm Femi Okay.
And I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in the stream.
Allegations of anti-Asian bias at one of the most selective colleges in the US, Harvard University.
We'll look at an ongoing lawsuit and what the case could mean for the future of race-based university admissions policies. You can share your thoughts with us through our live YouTube chat or via Twitter.
Does Harvard University discriminate against Asian American applicants? That is the question being asked in a lawsuit currently being heard in a US federal court. The plaintiff, Students for Fair Admission, says Asian Americans are held to a higher standard in the admissions process. They argue that Harvard admissions officers scored academically qualified Asian Americans lower on personality and character rankings. Harvard has denied any form of discrimination and defends its criteria, which it says uses race as one of many factors, including academics, geography, and socioeconomic background. So to what degree should race be a factor in college admissions? And what else is at stake in the Harvard case?
Well, joining us to discuss these issues in Boston, Jiang Li, a senior at Harvard. He's been assisting with the amicus brief in support of affirmative action in Harvard admissions. In Boston, Swan Lee, co-founder of the Asian American Coalition for Education. That's a group that believes affirmative action discriminates against Asian Americans. In New York, Jeannie Park, head of the Harvard Asian American Alumni Alliance, one of the Harvard-affiliated groups campaigning in support of affirmative action policies. And in New Haven, Connecticut, Roman Kandakar, a high school senior who is against affirmative action. Welcome, everyone, to the stream. I want to start with a voice from Harvard. This is Kelly. She's a student, a junior at Harvard University, and here's what she had to say about this hot-button issue.
This isn't a case of potential discrimination. This is a case of real discrimination. These affirmative action policies are negatively impacting Asian Americans and unfairly treating them simply because of their race. Discrimination on college campuses isn't something new. This is something that organizations such as the Leadership Institute's Campus Reform have been reporting on for years, and this discrimination is really happening right now. As Chief Justice John Roberts once said, the only way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race, and that's exactly what affirmative action policies do right now. And the only way to change that is to get rid of them.
Jeannie, strong perspective there from Kelly. So break this down for us. What is Harvard's admission process, and why do people like Kelly find it so problematic?
I think the reason that some people have issues with it, the process is a holistic admissions process, a whole person admissions process. And I think that, we've all learned a lot about Harvard's admissions process over the last few weeks. And one of the things that we've learned is it is how carefully the admissions office considers each person as an individual. And in terms of considering race, it's only one factor among many, many, many factors that's considered. And we were told that it is only considered as a plus factor for a candidate. But we've seen many files of applicants now, and what's clear is that admission is not at all determined by scores and grades. It's determined by a full consideration of what the admissions office believes is that student's potential, the potential to make the most of their education at Harvard and to go on and make a difference in the world with that education.
I want to show our audience a little bit of what it might be like to get into Harvard, or how difficult it is to get into Harvard. Have a look here on my laptop. This is what Harvard College Admissions and Financial Aid have actually shared with the general public. And this is a profile of the admitted class of 2022. Look at the applicants, 42,000. Look who was admitted, or who will be admitted, 2,000. It is incredibly difficult to get into Harvard. Jiang Li, you're one of the few people who managed to do that. And you saw your admissions file and what was written on it. What did you learn from that?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing I learned is that, again, Harvard takes a very holistic perspective when admitting applicants, right? So it's not just the grades and test scores that Harvard is admitting students on, and neither should it be, right? So from my own experience here as a undergraduate here at the college, the defining experience isn't that we have a lot of really, really smart students, right? It's also that they are so passionate in all these other things. So I think that Harvard is right to take a holistic perspective when deciding whether or not to admit an applicant. And I think that's really the biggest takeaway I learned from reading my admissions file.
And you've also been helping the court understand what that application process is like, what it's like to be a Harvard student, and you gave them information. What can you tell us about the information you gave the court to help them understand the situation better?
Yeah, so I talked a lot about my own personal experiences with diversity here. So I come from a very white suburb of Texas. I grew up without much diversity. Most of my students, most of my peers were white, right? And so after sort of my time here, I really realized just how necessary and crucial diversity is to my Harvard experience. If it hadn't been for the diversity of perspectives, the different people of color in my classes, my experience here would have been completely different in the worst way. So I think I just really wanted to put in that student perspective of why diversity is so important, why affirmative action is so important.
Jeannie, what's your biggest issue with this current court case saying that Harvard discriminates against Asian Americans?
My biggest issue with this case is that it is being brought by someone who has never been an advocate for the Asian American community, who has been fighting against race-conscious admissions policies at multiple universities. He's suing multiple universities. He's taken this to the Supreme Court and failed twice. And after he failed the last time in the Fisher case, he went out looking specifically for Asian American applicants. So this case is about ending affirmative action, and his only remedy that he seeks is for admissions to be completely race blind. And I think what's really important to remember is that race blind is not race neutral. You know, this is a country that is not where race is a factor in so many parts of our lives, especially in educational achievement and educational opportunity. It factors into the way that teachers and counselors look at you. It factors into the kinds of schools you have, the kinds of access you have to things like test prep. That is why race and ethnicity should be a factor that can be taken into account by the admissions office. Yes.
So, Jeannie, the person that you mention is called Edward Bloom. He is a conservative activist, and his aim is to get rid of affirmative action in the United States. Here he is talking to Fox News in December. Have a listen.
College administrators and bureaucrats and admissions officers are wed to the idea that your race should be used to help you, or your race should be used to harm you in your admissions process. Racial preferences that favored whites back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s was wrong.
Yeah.
Now racial preferences that favor African Americans and Hispanics, that's wrong as well. You cannot remedy past discrimination with new discrimination, and that's what colleges...
So our audience and people online as well have a lot to say about Ed Bloom. This is Natasha, who says, giving us a little reminder, a history lesson here, if you will. She says he funded Fisher versus Texas, which is an affirmative action case, which he lost. Then he turned to Asian American plaintiffs. He's never cared about racial discrimination. This case is purely about dismantling affirmative action with Asian Americans as cover. Another person also weighing in that same theme there, and Swan, I will give this to you. Sejal says, Ed Bloom says he's suing Harvard to fight racial discrimination at Asians, but anti-affirmative action crusaders like Bloom never attack legacy admissions, which are effectively affirmative action programs for wealthy white kids. We know what this is about. Hashtag not your cover. I'm wondering what your take is on that.
Yeah, all this is actually misrepresentation by many of the academics and special interest groups. If they go to Harvard trials at the Boston Federal Court, they will know the real situation. I was there, and actually the SFFA did fight against legacy admissions. They asked to remove legacy admissions. And legacy admissions and the racial consideration are often tied together. In 10 American states, after they banned the so-called affirmative action, which is not the real Kennedy affirmative action, which was already legislated into the Civil Rights Act 1964, Title VI. So Edward Bloom and the SFFA is using the real affirmative action to fight the fake affirmative action, which is really just discrimination. At the current stage, is mostly anti-Asian action, because Asian applicants, even though they're just 5% of the high school graduates every year, they are high performing, so they are often punished in most of the American colleges. They suffer from the lowest acceptance rates. So when people are picking on Edward Bloom's skin color without looking at the situation of Asian Americans being discriminated all over the country, that means they really don't have a case. They have nothing to pick on, so they have to pick on the legal consultant's skin color, and that is very simplistic and just not founded. So I hope they can pay more attention to Asian Americans, their state of being discriminated against.
So Swan, the reason,
it shows the moral paralysis people are having right now.
So Swan, the reason that I wanted to share with our audience a clip of Edward Bloom was not for his skin colour, but also he's a very well-known campaigner against affirmative action, and this goes back many, many years. So nothing about his colour, but definitely about his platform and what he's keen to do. So do you mind that there's this collaboration between you and an activist who wants affirmative action to go away? You're not necessarily concerned about Asian Americans and how they are being viewed by Harvard applications process, but affirmative action full stop, to end.
It is actually an untrue claim that he is fighting against affirmative action, because if you read his Washington Post opinion, he clearly said he supports socioeconomic status-based affirmative action. And actually, you don't have affirmative action on the page for everyone to look at and critique. Affirmative action, there's no Affirmative Action Act. What it really is at the current stage is racial consideration, as said in Bucky case and the Fisher 2 case. And there is no way to control how much colleges use this to in their admission process. Okay. So the most vulnerable members of society often get made the collateral damage, which is the Asian American applicants. When you treat a whole group of people, millions of people, as just one type of person, you are really doing injustice to most of the working class or income applicants. The Asian American students are just really struggling to make it work out with their family, with their economic situation.
Let me share this with you. This is a pie chart. Have a look at this pie chart. We put it together using the statistics from Harvard for their class of 2022 admissions. Going to leave it on screen for a little while. Roman, have a look at this. So the minority of students in terms of a block would be white American students, and then we can look at 15% of African Americans going to be in the class of 2022. Asian Americans are 22%, a little over 22%, and we have Hispanics at 12%, and Native Americans at 1.90%, and then Native Hawaiians, just a tiny, tiny little sliver, 0.4% there. So looking at Asian Americans, 22% of this class of 2022, is that problematic? Is that a figure that you'll think, this is for Roman? Roman, is that problematic? Do you see anything in this pie chart that you're thinking, this is not diversity that I'm seeing right here?
That was raised after 2014.
And this is for Roman. Roman, hello. Come into the conversation.
Okay, so if we really look into what's been happening throughout the history, for the race-based affirmative action is, again, fake affirmative action. It is important that we figure out a way to make it into race neutral. What we see currently right now is not race neutral at all. It is pure discrimination. When we look at that pie chart, all we're looking at is just a bunch of numbers. You're just putting people into groups, as in we have certain number of people as this ethnicity, we have certain number of people as this ethnicity. It's not what we want to look at. What is a holistic review? A holistic review is to make sure you look at someone in every way possible. But when you look at the race, it automatically creates some sort of a discrimination, and we don't want that at all.
Well, Zhang and Jeannie both said that with the applications process, there is a holistic review. Zhang, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think maybe there's some fundamental misunderstanding of what a holistic admissions process is, right? So you're not admitting an applicant exclusively because they're Black, right? We are taking
But
into
you're not
other
involved in the admission process,
factors.
John. You're not
Sorry?
involved in the admission you are not an admission official at Harvard. You were never involved in the admission process. You don't know what's going on.
The files have been released. We
But
know that
I was there at the court trial, and I heard inside details about the admission process.
Allow
and that's not what they do.
Allow Zhang to finish his thought, and then you can
But she
say why you have an issue with it.
Process. She's just a student.
Hold on. But the whole thing is about students, so you can't say just a student. Zhang, go ahead, and then Swan, then you can come back.
I mean, just again, like from my
This is
experiences,
outsider.
you're not admitting applicants just because they're Black, just because they're a different race, right? You're taking into consideration all these different factors like socioeconomic status, where they're from, etc. And like Swan, to your earlier point about how instead of race-based affirmative action, we should have affirmative action that's based on socioeconomic status. I don't think that that's an adequate replacement of race-based affirmative action, because that totally ignores the fact that racism still exists. Race still really matters in how we live our lives, right? If you have a white applicant and you have a Black applicant and all things are equal, these two people are still going to have very different experiences because institutional racism still exists, etc. And even if you look at the numbers, although people of color, Black and brown students might be more disproportionately poor, the actual number of white applicants that are poor is going to be extremely more high. So in reality, this is, again, only a policy that is going to benefit white applicants.
It's not a matter of who will benefit. Edward Bloom and SFFA is not just doing it for Asian Americans, but for all Americans, especially the working class Americans, because right now, when they use the racial approach, it allows upper class students to snatch opportunities from lower income students, and that's not fair. I went to the court trial at Boston Federal Court, and I listened to the defense, how they are justifying their racial consideration. And everything they said about how a Vietnamese student using pencils to practice English, how an African-American applicant has certain kind of career goal. And I listened to all those evidence they use to justify racial consideration, and none of them is racial consideration. It's all from the applications package. The material, the information is all there. Even though they don't consider race at all that information is already in the applicant's package. All that information is there. What they're not saying is the racial stereotyping and racial bigotry they are associated with their racial identity.
Jeannie, I know you want to get in there, but I want to bring in a couple of tweets from our community. This really was brought up in my mind when I heard a couple of phrases from Swan. This is an op-ed by a member of our community. This is the title: Affirmative action at Harvard doesn't hurt most Asian Americans because we more often go to community colleges. And the idea behind this, he writes in this tweet, Ryan says, the main point of this op-ed was always to emphasize how our community should remain dubious when folks like Edward Bloom, also best known for challenging voter rights laws, claim that they suddenly and solely care about our success as a group. But moving on from that point, though, keeping that in mind, but moving on just a little bit, I want to bring you to this tweet. This is from Janelle, who says, spending my life conducting research on and teaching about Asian Americans has made me keenly aware of how race has shaped the experiences of Asian Americans and made more aware of how Asian Americans fit into the larger U.S. racial landscape. I don't buy charges of discrimination at Ivies. Asian Americans, many who are Chinese American like me, are enrolled at Yale at a rate 3 times greater than their numbers in the population. This is not lack of inclusion. So I bring that up, Jeannie, because I wonder, and what she's saying, is there not a danger that there might actually be discrimination here that will be swept under the rug because of the larger issue of affirmative action?
I think that it's important, definitely, for the admissions office to be carefully monitoring their processes at all times. I hope that the admissions office has very strong training around implicit bias. That's something we haven't quite discussed yet. There has been some evidence that there may be implicit bias that creeps into the process, for instance, when teachers and counselors write recommendations, and how do you work against that? I think that, I'm sure there are always ways for an admissions office to be improved and to guard against any kinds of discrimination. I have to go back, though, and again challenge the assertion that Edward Bloom is pro-affirmative action. That is absolutely not true. He has very much said he is against it. And in terms of, as Zhang mentioned, socioeconomics, the research has shown that if you just try to admit based on socioeconomics, you decrease the diversity of the class dramatically. So if you're going in that direction, again, that is a solution that is taking us back in time to becoming a less diverse college community. And a society that is, less educated around issues of diversity. And, one of the things that Harvard tries to do is build leaders for all different communities. And that means that they need to admit a class that includes students from all those communities who are committed to those communities, who have experience in those communities, and are going to go on to serve those communities. That includes students from Chinese American immigrant communities. That includes students from Vietnamese communities, from South Asian communities, from Bangladeshi American communities, from Puerto Rican American communities. I mean, this is why Harvard is trying to create diversity. And also, this diversity benefits Asian Americans. I mean, the Asian American students at Harvard and at colleges need to learn in diverse environments so that they can go on to work in and lead this incredibly diverse society that we live in that's becoming more and more diverse. And I think what universities like Harvard are trying to do is to, build that leadership for the future.
Okay, Swan, I just want to share this. Swan, if I may, let me share this with you. This comes from Kirk Capezza, who is following the court case that's happening right now regarding Harvard and its application process. And Kirk says that it's day 8 in the Harvard discrimination case. On the stand, Mark Hansen, who previously worked at the university's Office of Institutional Research, in his sworn testimony, Hansen says that Asian Americans are at a disadvantage in Harvard's admission process. And then the daily student magazine newspaper, the Harvard Crimson, also says internal Harvard review showed disadvantage for Asian applicants. Nobody has spelled out in this conversation so far, what are these disadvantages? Swan, can you say them for us in a sentence? Be very clear. What are they?
It's racial stereotyping and racial bigotry and racial profiling in the college admissions process, not just for Asians, but for everybody. I want to comment on what Jenny Park just pointed out, how they are trying to bring in representatives of different communities, but that's really just racial profiling. Students of any racial group are good enough to lead any racial group and all the racial groups. They are not just limited to be community leaders of their own ethnicity. I think the fake affirmative action racial consideration is just a tool for white supremacy to perpetuate racism and look down upon and just spiritual defeat and psychologically subjugate non-white students at elite colleges. I think that's really very problematic and just morally wrong. It's a genetic factor.
I kind of want to bring in the question of diversity right now.
So I like that you sparked something there, but I want to bring in our community member, another Harvard student. This is Daniel. He sent us a video comment on the way forward, pushing this conversation a bit ahead. This is what he told the stream.
When people talk about finding a solution to the alleged cap on Asian Americans in Harvard admissions, I'd first point out that it's not actually clear whether or not discrimination is actually happening. That's still being contested in court. But if it is, I think it's much more likely that a solution would be found looking at other admissions programs like athletic recruitment, legacy admissions, the Dean's List, and children of faculty, all of which have been shown to disproportionately favor white students over Asian students. And keeping in mind that Harvard is still around half white, I think maybe cutting back on legacy and recruitment could do more to get at the heart of the problem rather than cutting back on affirmative action. Some people also think socioeconomic class would work as an alternative, but I don't think that's viable, at least not alone, given that race still hurts your opportunity in America regardless of your class.
Jang, in a sentence, what do you make of your classmates' thoughts there?
Yeah, so I mean, I completely agree with all that he's saying, right? Like socioeconomic status isn't a good replacement for affirmative action, the kinds of things that race-based affirmative action is trying to get at, because race still matters in how we live our lives.
And Roman?
It matters to everybody.
And Roman?
Yeah, so when it comes to this, I've always said the same exact thing. When we look back in history, when we looked at race, that's exactly what caused discrimination. That's what's causing discrimination right now. I want to go back to the topic of diversity.
Roman, we've got 30 seconds left, so thank you so much. I really appreciate your input for our conversation. We will take it online and continue the conversation there and continue to watch this court case between talking about the application process for Asian Americans at Harvard University. So Swan, Roman, Jeannie and Jang, thank you for being part of the conversation. Malika and I will see you online. Swan will continue to debate, but we have to wrap up the show. Thank you, everybody. Take care.